I would really be clear about what does more meaning mean. So for some people, more meaning
Mm,
could be more money. I was talking to my son's
yeah.
godfather recently, and we were, talking about his most recent job move, and he was lamenting that he's never really worked in a place that really appreciated him. And I said, well, let's stop and think about that. When you worked at the Capitol, you actually had a great boss who really did appreciate you. And he said, but I didn't make the money I wanted. I said, well, that's the question, right? Like, what does more meaningful mean to you? What does more fulfilling? What does appreciation look like for you?
Welcome to Gap to Gig, the show for dads navigating the in-between season when work, identity, and priorities start asking different questions. Here we talk about what that season looks like and how to move through it with intention. I'm your host, Michael Jacobs, and today's guest is Natalie Holder. She's an employment lawyer and executive coach who helps professionals navigate some of the most difficult moments in their careers, from workplace trauma to being overlooked, underestimated, or stuck in environments that just aren't working. She's led global HR compliance for Starwood Hotels and Resorts, served as a chief diversity officer, and even delivered court-ordered training in high-stakes discrimination cases. So she's seeing firsthand what happens when workplace culture breaks down and what it actually takes to rebuild from it. What I appreciate about Natalie's work is it's not just theoretical. It's really grounded in real situations, real consequences, and real decisions people have to make when their work and their life start pulling in different directions. Natalie, I'm really excited to chat with you today. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I want to start with the idea of work and life starting to pull in different directions because I think a lot of dads listening will recognize this feeling, even if they don't always say it out loud. When someone feels off at work but can't quite explain why, what's usually going on beneath the surface?
That's a heavy question because it's a heavy feeling, right? And it
Right.
doesn't just happen overnight. Often it is this compilation of experiences that we've had. It's the compilation of disappointments. It's the compilation of unexpected events occurring that really aren't matching up with what we expected when we walked into that work environment. I always joke that the first day, that's probably going to be the day that you are in your
Yeah.
organization, because that is the day where everyone's, starting the experience with expectation and the whole idea that, all right, this is going to be a really great work environment. However, once you get like 90 days into the experience, 100 days into the experience, that's when there's more reality. That's where you start seeing who the players are. That's when you start encountering, who are your supporters, who are your champions versus who are your detractors, who are your
Right.
saboteurs in the workplace. And those are people that will appear and surface at different times. And sadly, if we have more of the saboteurs as opposed to the champions, that is what's going to pull down our experience. I've often said people don't leave bad jobs, people leave bad managers. And
Yes.
sometimes it is that manager who's the saboteur, and that's often the worst experience because it's your manager who you're looking toward as the person who's going to be your mentor, as your person who's going to be the supporter, the person who's going to make sure that you get quality work and get the credit for doing it.
Right. And you talk about saboteurs, and oftentimes it feels like we can be our own saboteurs even at work, right? Like sometimes whether it's doubt that creeps in or maybe, we get feedback we don't like and we start to get into our own heads, right? Can we be sabotaging ourselves just as much as others have? Others may cause us to not enjoy our jobs, or is it typically an outside force that is always causing this disconnect between what we hope to be achieving at work and what we actually do?
So there's this controversy as to whether or not there is such a thing as like self sabotage, because the whole notion is, well, when you engage in behaviors that don't exactly inure to your benefit, you're basically working off of the signals that you're getting. However, I do
Right.
believe that you can be working against your own self interest at times. You could be positioning yourself in such a way that you are not going to get accomplishments that you're looking for. You could be that person who's not understanding the organizational culture that you're in. And as a result, not really aligning with it. And as we've all experienced, people will oftentimes prefer to work with the people that they like as opposed to the people who are the most experienced and the best at what they do. How many times have you ever seen someone who was mediocre to just average getting all sorts of great opportunities, all because they made the right relationships with the right people? And so
Right.
there are some people who, yes, definitely, engage in those kinds of behaviors that don't necessarily align with what would be a way of advancing their career. And there are ways to definitely, tap into that. There are ways to correct and check that and making sure that you're not going down that route. But I often would question and wonder, so what is prompting you to not necessarily go along with the grain of your organization? Like if you understand that you're in an organization in where people enjoy FaceTime, but you're that person who said, "Oh no, I'm not going to, have lunch in the cafeteria. I'm not going to, engage with my colleagues." I often wonder and ask, what's getting in that way? And a lot of times we make sense that it's time for us to change. And I'm really big on just, the pivot. And in fact, if anyone wants to take a pivot assessment that I've created, it's on my website, questei.org. And the pivot assessment, it's what? Less than 2 minutes and you're out. It's an opportunity to really just see what's gnawing at you. What's no longer resonating with you about the opportunity that you walked into with this, employment that you were seeking or that you've landed. And most important, the question is, all right, so what are you going to do about that? You've gotten the
Right.
signal that something's just not resonating for you anymore. How are you going to respond to it? Are you going to respond to it in a way in where you take a downward spiral in your own organization? Or do you start positioning yourself for greater opportunities outside your organization? Or maybe even finding a different department that might be more aligned with what you're looking for and who you are.
Right. That's a great point of there sometimes you need to shift into a different role, right? And whether it's within the same organization or not, like maybe you just need to work in a different department or work for a different manager. Now, how frequent or how easy those opportunities come by is another question, but you don't know what opportunities could be there unless you put yourself out there, right? Like you said, that, you know, sometimes you have to make those relationships with people in order to find those opportunities, right? They always say it's not what you know, but who you know, right? And I think that to some degree applies here. But also the, let's say, stress that you feel at work or that negative feeling that you're getting because of the job's not aligned with what you're doing, or you have a boss you don't get along with, or somebody maybe sabotaging what you're trying to accomplish. That stress, that dysfunction at work could not just spill out at work, but also outside of work, at home, right? How do you see when these moments happen at work? How do you see that spill out, particularly into life at home or life outside the office? Like, what happens there?
So we like to think that our lives are these containers, that there's work, that there's life at home, that there are our community obligations or our community endeavors. It's really more of a potpourri. It's all mixed in there because that which is happening to you at home is filtering into and it's seeping into your work life and vice versa. If you're that
Yeah.
person who is, working really long hours, feeling as though you're not being credited with the work that you're doing, that you're not being given the accolades or even any sort of, credit for what you're doing. Can you just imagine the conversations that you're having at home? You have a
Right.
partner, you have children. It definitely all seeps into each other and it definitely follows you. And one of the most important things is to be cognizant of how and what's happening to you in these environments. I remember when I first started practicing law, I was the first attorney in my family. And I was the first person to work in a profession in where there really wasn't a 9 to 5 expectation. So my parents didn't really understand the whole idea of it's 6 o'clock. Why aren't you at home?
Right.
Why aren't you at home cooking dinner for your husband? They didn't understand that because that was just not their norm. And so sometimes we have to have the conversations that we don't think we need to have with the people who are in our homes, with the people who we live with, the people who love us. And sometimes we have to really deconstruct what's happening so that they understand the experience. Because if we're expecting people to read our minds and understand, oh, well, yeah, I work for a jerk, and to understand what does that jerk show up as, right? So would I say you're acting like a jerk and you say someone's acting like a jerk, we have two very different definitions. So
Right.
it's so
Right.
important that you do share with the people in your life, hey, this is what's happening, and this is how I'm trying to navigate it. And I'll tell you, some of the smartest people who I've run into who've managed this are the people who bring their partners into their experiences. They strategize with their partners. They figure out what is a course of action. I remember I had a colleague who was so who was so strategic with this. They would actually use their spouse as a way to curry favor with their supervisor. Now, it wasn't
Hmm.
anything, illicit. It wasn't anything like indecent proposal, nothing like that. It was
Right.
it
Right.
was simply understanding that at the, at the holiday party, that the supervisor and this person's spouse would enjoy talking about a certain activity. I think they both enjoyed golfing. And so, because the supervisor now had this positive touch point through the spouse, that made life a little bit more palatable for my colleague in the workplace. Because the
Hmm.
memory now of my colleague was, oh, I remember having a really cool conversation with your spouse. I'm going to cut you
Right.
some slack here, or I'm going to, make sure that, you know, a few things are easier for you in the workplace.
That's so interesting because it's like it's almost as if in that particular scenario, it's like the boss doesn't want to disappoint the spouse now, right? So it allows them to it allows you as the employee to be like to have this additional thing in your favor to maybe make just ease things a little bit. I'm curious, you say like if you have a spouse, but not all people have unfortunately have a partner at the moment. Like if you don't have that person at home, what other is there somebody else that you can go to, or is there some other method you can use to kind of help you rebalance yourself if you are in a toxic environment at work? Or maybe it's vice versa. Like maybe it's the other way around where something's going on in your life. Maybe you have a sick family member, or maybe, you know, something negative is going on outside of work and you need to lean on work to help you kind of rebalance things. How do you, when those things are kind of off kilter, or you don't necessarily have that resource, how do you manage the situation?
Absolutely. I am a huge believer in having your personal board of directors. Your personal board of directors are the people who you surround yourself with, who are invested in your success. These are the people you trust. These are the people who you should trust. So often we look for people to serve on our personal board of directors when we need them, but they should actually be in place well before we need them. There's a really good saying, if you haven't developed the relationship by the time you need it, it's too late. And so you can structure your personal board any which way you want, but I highly recommend, like recently I did a talk for a consulting firm and I was talking to their young employees group, and I said you should have 4 seats. I recommend 4 seats on your personal board of directors to align with the 4 quadrants of your work life. Number one, you should have someone who has served as a senior level professional, a CEO preferably, someone who has been at that chief executive level, someone who sat and maybe even led in the C-suite. Why? Because as you mentioned, life happens to us, but we need to be able to communicate that life is happening to us in a way that will make our supervisors, make our organization understand and actually empathize with us as opposed to sympathize with us. And even worse, not retaliate against us. And so it is that CEO who helps you to translate very emotional language into that strategic business language. It's your CEO who's going to move you from well, this is not fair. I don't want to do this, to instead helping you to communicate in a way in where you're talking about the dollars and cents of your organization. For instance, you know, this move might require us to invest in X, Y, and Z, and that might be a detriment to us. Or, as you're talking about, having a family member who's not well, being able to express that, maybe working remotely is something that would inure to the benefit of the organization, because you would be able to be much more productive and being able to manage a situation that is definitely manageable.
Right.
So basically that's the person who's helping you to really craft your message. You have an industry insider. Your industry insider is the person who's telling you what's happening in your industry well before it happens. This is the person who was telling you back in 2022 that remote work was going to be a thing of the past, that we're going to start seeing more return to the office. This is the person who back in, let's say, in 2019 was talking about the rise of AI. Your industry insider is that person who is really, watching market conditions and is able to help you understand what you might not already know. You should also have someone who's a contrarian. So people often think that a contrarian is someone who doesn't have your best interest, but a lot of times your contrarian is someone. So
Yep.
sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it is a friend or a colleague, but that contrarian is the person who is holding up a mirror to your blind spots. This is the person who's asking you the questions that are critical for making sure that you're avoiding pitfalls. This is the person who's making sure that you're not making a rash decision, and also making sure that you're not making a decision that is being communicated as only a benefit to you, but also a benefit to your organization. And then lastly, I'm biased. I believe that your personal board should have someone from human resources or an employment lawyer. Why? We are the people who have seen everything from your onboarding agreements to your severance agreement. We've seen everything in between. And so we're the people who can help you to make sure that you're not sending that 2 a.m. missive that is poorly worded and will not be well by your supervisor. And so
Right.
if you don't have these people in your life, I think it becomes that much more challenging, because these are the people who have the experiences that really help to expand our finite experiences. Each one of us only has a certain number of touch points and perspectives. But when you are
Right.
multiplying that by 4, you now have an advantage in where you're now able to see around corners that you didn't even know existed before.
Right. I love this. It's such a powerful idea because it allows you to strengthen yourself through the experiences of others, right? And I've done something similar to this when I started my first business a long time ago. I created I call them a board of advisors, right? For the business, kind of, sort of, but really it was for me, right? I was the one that met with them one on one. I brought them all together once a year so we can have bigger conversations. But it was, for me, it was like I found people that had experience that I didn't have yet, that have built a business, not necessarily in the same field as me, because I was going into a field that was very, very new. There wasn't a lot of industry experts per se in that regards, but I had somebody who was very good at marketing, somebody who came from the advertising and marketing world and had sold his firm for a lot of money and had a lot of experience with a lot of different clients. I had somebody on the logistics side who had his own warehouses and managed businesses and built these businesses around logistics. And because I was selling a product and I needed to have something with logistics. And I had a finance professor who, taught at a business school, but also was an expert in financials and would help me kind of understand these things. And it wasn't like, yes, I could go to them and be like, I have this specific issue. Like, I'm trying to figure out, how do I do this one thing for my customer? But the value I really got out of them was when we just sit down for a catch-up conversation of like, here's what's going on. This is what I've been working on. And they can start poking holes, right? And they'd be like, in my experience, I could, this is what happened when I did this. And it allowed me to skip some steps, right? Because they already know what the result of that experience is. So I can just skip right to that because they've outlined, this is what you have to do to get to that step. Or they can introduce me to somebody that can help me do that, right? Yeah. Now maybe a little bit different than what you're saying, because yours is even more personal than that, which I love. And I wish I had thought of this idea earlier, or heard of this idea earlier, because I could see the ways that could help me. Because sometimes it's just nice to have a sounding board. Yes, I use my spouse as a sounding board, right? And I will say that, this is something I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to work on. Can you help me think it through? And she'll have ideas, and we'll bounce things back and forth. But to have different people, different experts, or just people that have different perspectives, right? Because it's so easy to get closed in on your own perspective and just have this very narrow viewpoint. And yes, sometimes that's good to help you get to your goal, but oftentimes you're missing a lot of the things that fall outside that narrow lane that you're driving down. And to have this personal board of directors, I mean, I don't think it really matters what age you're at or what stage you're at in your career. I'm just thinking, like, right now, like, who do I want to now? I want to now build a new personal board of directors. Who do I want to ask? Like, where do I want to get those from? And when I built my advisory board, I went to the professionals I'd hired to do things. I went to my legal representation. I went to my accountant, and I said, these are the types of people I'm looking for. Who do you know? Can you introduce me? And I can find people. I found a professor from the school that I attended. And so I was able to find people in different ways. But for personal board directors, I'm curious where, I think that other dads that I, talk to on a day-to-day basis, they'd be like, well, where do I start? Like, who do I even ask? Where do I find these people? Right. Like, I don't know a contrarian. Like, right. So you have suggestions in terms of like how to actually build the board, your personal board of directors? Like, who do you ask? How do you kind of put it all
Absolutely.
together?
So, when we graduate from school, our social circles all of a sudden become very much shrunken. We stop meeting the same volumes of people who we met when we were freshmen in college, when we were in graduate school.
Right.
And so it really becomes a matter of our, organizational commitments and work. Those are the two main bases for us to have, a social network. And so, yes, it can seem challenging. However, I'm a big believer in getting involved in your professional associations. So I loved how you mentioned that you found people with the subject matter expertise to serve on your board. I'll admit, when I talk about a board of directors for your, own personal development, I'm industry agnostic. However, I do believe that if you're creating
Right.
a board for your business, you absolutely should have people who have industry expertise and knowledge, but the concepts are still the same. So, I
Right.
remember, so I used to, as the chief diversity officer at Stanford's National Accelerator Laboratory. And twice a year we had these these governance meetings. And I won't say who, but I had colleagues that did not appreciate these meetings because these really were, the open the hood meetings in where our governance board wanted to see what were our risks, how are we managing risk, and how are we making sure that we were keeping our initiatives steady, and what should we be looking for. I love preparing for those meetings because I love being able to have someone really, pressure test what I was doing. I really wanted to make sure for the next 6 months, I also understood what my responsibilities were. And so I must admit,
Right.
the whole idea of even, with my business, which is, a business that conducts workplace investigations, and we look at, creating a bigger and better organizational culture for an organization. I definitely chose people to be on my board who have subject matter expertise, who understand the risks of my business. And there is overlap also into my personal life where, like I said, I do believe in looking at your professional trade associations. So, for instance, as an attorney, I'm a member of the American Bar Association. I'm a member of a few other legal associations because I do a lot of public speaking. I'm also a member of like the National Speakers Association. I'm on their board, and so on and so on. And so I would say that that's really a good place to start, looking at what are your professional associations around you. Also, what are your proclivities? What do you enjoy doing? What puts a smile on your face? I remember years ago, I mean, I don't have the time for it now, unfortunately, but I was a member of a few meetups. I used to be in a meetup for people who spoke Spanish. And that was immense because I met people who not only spoke Spanish, but also had insights about other interests that I also had in terms of traveling, in terms of dining, in terms of culture. And so I'd also say, where could you, tap into the people who have some sort of social interest that you share? Interestingly enough, my house of worship recently hosted a seminar designed for people who are professionals, designed for people who are trying to figure out, how are we navigating in a space where, there have been huge governmental layoffs in the federal government. I live in DC, so that obviously is a huge conversation for people in my sphere. And so that's just like another touch point. I would say the most important thing is just to
Yep.
keep your eyes and ears open and to watch and to see how are other people navigating. There's a huge other network out there that we haven't even spoke about or touched on. And it's called LinkedIn. I am a big
Yep.
believer in looking at the people on LinkedIn that you admire, not with envy, but with the potential of being able to understand how they got to where they are. So, so many
Yep.
of us have that like LinkedIn envy where you're tired of seeing people, say, congratulate me because I did this or I got promoted. But I actually enjoy that because I think, okay, so sky is not the limit. There's still something more out there. And I'm a big believer that there is a huge pie, a pie that's large enough for all of us to divide. And so there's no need to feel envy or jealousy when someone else is achieving their goal, when someone else has figured out how to, launch a business, how to scale their business, how to, IPO their business. Because guess what? That is someone who can now tutor and mentor me. So without any
Right.
shame, sometimes actually, I do have like a list of people who I follow, you know, re- follow religiously. I make sure that, I like their posts. I'm like the second person to like their posts because I genuinely enjoy their work. And I want to be able that when I reach out to that person, I can genuinely say, I admire your work and I would love to have a conversation with you. And for that person to feel as though they're not wasting their time on me because I've done my homework and
Right.
that I am someone who's going to do something incredible with the information that they share with me.
Yep. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think LinkedIn in particular, and I think for me, at least over the past year or so, has just been a great tool to put myself out there to meet new people that I would have no idea that they existed beforehand. Sometimes they reach out to me, sometimes I reach out to them. Of, but we have a common connection of we have some sort of interest. And I think to build on what you're saying of like, yes, you can follow the path of somebody, quote unquote, ahead of you in terms of like they've started their business, they've IPO'd their business, but also could be they found that next job. In this economy right now where jobs are kind of seem to be getting the job market might be getting tighter and tighter. It's like, okay, somebody found a job. They probably made some connections along the way. Maybe they can introduce you to somebody, right? Or maybe they came across an opportunity that wasn't right for them, but might be right for you. And again, it comes back to what you said before, like putting yourself out there, right? You have to, you know, allow yourself to talk to others and to make others aware of who you are and what you're about in order to find some
No
of
one
these
can hire you
opportunities.
if you are a secret. And
Right.
one other spin on it in terms of reaching out to the people who you are seeing or crushing it on LinkedIn. These are now people who might be able to hire you. So every time I see
Right.
that person getting promoted and I know that someone's in their job search, I think, oh, how can I connect them? Because there might be mutual interest.
Right. Right. Love that. That's so great. So one of the things I'm curious about for this person on board of directors, again, I'm so fascinated with it. I think it's such a smart idea and it's not something that has to be overwhelming, right? I think on the surface, when you're like, you know, create a personal board of directors, you're like, board of directors, that's a big title. It's a big thing. It's really not. It's just a collection of human beings, right? It's just like you know, not a friend group, but it's a friend group. Like it's a group of people that you can bring together and you can work with one-on-one or maybe multiples at a time of like, here's something I'm working on. The one of the things that I think people get caught up on is like what's in it for, what do I have to give up? What do I have to give to the board of directors in order for them to help me? And I think what I found in my own experience, and I advise some younger entrepreneurs, and to me, that is why, like, seeing them achieve their goals to me is the value that I get, right? It's sharing my experience and maybe making an introduction for them. To me, that is payment, more than enough payment, right? I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but if your personal board of directors is not necessarily a paid position. So, like, why would somebody join your personal board of directors? Like, what is in it for them? Like, I think I can explain it, but I'm curious what your take is on why people would be willing to do that. Because I think one of the things that holds us back, and I think in particular for dads who, we have a lot on our plate already in terms of like figuring out we have to show up for work and we have to show up for our family and our friends, the people that are closest to us. Like, all right, what else do I have to do? This board of directors thing sounds great because I think it could help me, but do I have enough to give them? And, I think it's hard for us to admit, like, yeah, we actually probably do have enough to give them. We might not realize what we're giving these people on board of directors. So I'm curious, like, what is your take on terms of like why people would join your board of directors?
I think the other perspective also is that you already have so much that you're giving your personal board. Because remember, these are people
Yes.
who are not hired to help you. And I do believe in sometimes hiring the help. Don't get me wrong. I do believe that sometimes you do need to hire that coach. You do need to hire that advisor. You do need to hire that person who can help you negotiate, a
Yeah.
matter. However, your personal board are people who you know. These are people who are in your circle already. And as you said, there's fulfillment in where if this person sees that their advice and counsel is actually helping you get somewhere else, many times these people just want to see you pay it forward. These people just want to know that
Right.
when they contact you, that you pick up the phone as well. So to me, that's also a part of the exchange, if there is one with your personal board. It's that they're not pouring into an empty vessel, that they're seeing that you're
Yeah.
actually taking their advice, that you're following up on the introductions that they're making for you, that you're telling them about your wins. You're telling them about your, not so wins. You're telling them about,
Right.
how you also plan to do well for someone else. That there's an element of, all right, if I do well, you will also do well. And that I think a lot of times is what will inspire someone to be on that personal board. And I just want to be clear that when I say a personal board, unlike my advisory board, my personal board doesn't all meet at one time. So my advisory board for my
Right.
business, yes, we have a standing meeting. We meet in fall and meet in the spring. Once again, I love that 6 months, where I have 6 months to implement everything that I get from the last meeting. However, my personal board, these are just people, as you mentioned, a collection of human beings. These are my thought partners whenever I feel as though I have a gap. I remember a few years ago, I was working remotely. And once again, I was at Stanford at the time. I was working remotely. I live in Maryland. And of course, Stanford's in Palo Alto, California. And
Right.
even though I was hired during COVID and I was working remotely, there came a point when, yes, we're getting back into the office. And when I got the phone call that I had to be back in the office, I thought, oh my gosh, I don't think I can do this because I've now structured my life around creating really strong pillars in my new community. During the time that I worked for Stanford, I had moved from Washington, D.C. to Maryland because my son really needed a school that would support him. He had a lot of challenges, and we understood eventually through testing and through a number of analyses that he really did have different abilities. And so we found a school in Maryland that loved him, a school that was supporting him, a school where he was thriving. And I thought to myself, gosh, do I really want to blow all of this up? And I remember looking at his Spider-Man backpack thinking, I can't do this to him. I need to find a way to work remotely. And so it was my personal board that I reached out to about various questions that I had. My CEO said, look, you have not made the business case to these people as to why you should work remotely. My insider said, yeah, give it up. You will have to move out there because the whole idea of working remotely is no longer something that your institution wants to support. And most other businesses are now starting to move in that track. My contrarian explained to me, all right, so you made the really good, case to me as to why you should stay. But what's in it for Stanford? They get out of this.
Right.
And so I'll admit, HR, employment law, and coaching. I believe that we should all have a friend who's a coach. Because if you can't afford coaching, coaches actually coach, even when they're not supposed to. And so I went from a whiny, I can't move, I don't want to move, to instead saying, I live in Maryland, which is the third largest state for life sciences investments. We are a life sciences laboratory. Living here gives me the opportunity to create relationships with entities that could feed millions of dollars into our research. I was able to continue working for 2 more years remotely. And so that's really the
Amazing.
power of what your board of directors can do for you when you pull them together
Right.
and you call them in that moment of need. And when I was able to share with my board that, hey, here's what happened, they were all happy for me.
Yep. Exactly. I love that. It's such a great example of what it looks like when it works, right? Of like you were able to leverage your personal board to come up with a solution that worked for you and work for Stanford, for the organization you were working for. But there's also the other side of it was your board got something out of it too, right? They got the satisfaction of seeing you succeed. They got to experience that with you. They got to talk through some of this stuff with you. And which just to me cements this fact of like, what's in it for your board? There are good human beings out there, right? And if you find them and put them on your board, that is more than enough satisfaction. And I would venture to say that your board would say that they got just as much value out of being on your board as you did of having them on your board. Even though the board was set up for you as your personal board of directors, they still got something out of it. They got satisfaction. They got experience. They learned something too, probably in that process as they were thinking through
And
these
I'd
things
also
with you.
throw out there, not everyone's looking for a transactional relationship. So not everyone's,
Yeah.
tuned into WIIFM, what's in it for me when they're thinking about helping another human being. As you said, there are some good human
Right.
beings out there. And I'm not a jerk. I mean, when
Yes.
my personal board of directors need something from me, I'm that person who can sometimes give them the employment law advice that they need. So recently I was talking to the CEO who sits on my board and on my personal board, that is. And she shared with me a vulnerability. And she actually thanked me because I'm that person who provides positive feedback to her. I'm that person who I'll listen to her, I'll, hear her situations, and I'll think, well, is this possible? What have you thought about this?
Right.
And I guess the coach in me is always thinking, okay, what if? And so
Yep.
even though it's definitely not transactional, I feel as though I get so much more from her than, she gets from me technically. It's our friendship that really is the exchange.
Yep. Right. That's a great point. It's yes, they're playing a role on your board, but there's also the relationship is more important, right? And whether it's friendship or mentorship or however whatever role they kind of fit in that, at the end of the day, you're building relationships with these
Oh,
people, right?
absolutely.
And you find the right relationships with the right people to make your board. And maybe you don't, maybe you bring someone on your board and they're not the right fit for you. And, that their role changes and maybe you replace them on the board. There's ways to handle that. But it's like, at the end of the day, it's just like building any other relationship, but there's a certain purpose for your board of directors. Would that be a fair assessment?
Exactly. And it was interesting. I just realized that I was talking to one of my other board of directors yesterday who is my HR person on the board. And she works for a major entertainment company. And I was just listening to her talk about how her daughter, unfortunately, had an injury and was getting surgery. And just being that voice of listening and care. Once again, it's the friendship. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm a big believer that I might not be able to exchange gold with you, but I can definitely exchange heart with you.
Love that. I, there's something else in what you just said that really jumped out at me that I want to highlight, which was you are you have a ton of experience in HR already, but you also have an HR person on your board, right? On your personal board, right? That to me is a great reminder of like you could be the best at your job, but there's still somebody else with other experiences that could be
Oh,
valuable to you.
absolutely.
And you can't just fill up your board with what you think your weaknesses are. You also need to supplement your strengths. And that just jumped out at me like, wait, you are when I think of HR, I think of you, but you also just thought of somebody else to put on your board to talk, to help you talk through some of these things because they have different experiences, right? And they might have different perspectives on that. There's so much I want to talk about, but I've got like two more quick questions I want to run by you before we get into the speed round. For someone who wants more meaningful work and or finding more meaning in the work that they're doing currently, but doesn't want to blow up their life to get there, what do you suggest is the first step?
I would really be clear about what does more meaning mean? So for some people, more meaning
Mm,
could be more money. I was talking to my son's
yeah,
godfather recently, and we were, talking about his most recent job move. And he was lamenting that he's never really worked in a place that really appreciated him. And I said, well, let's stop and think about that. When you worked at the Capitol, you actually had a great boss who really did appreciate you. And he said, but I didn't make the money I wanted. I said, well, that's the question, right? Like, what does more meaningful mean to you? What does more fulfilling? What does appreciation look like for you? Because, like I said, you can have a definition
right,
of a word that I might have a completely definition for. So I think we've got to be very clear first about what does that more meaningful career look like for us. And there's no shame if it's more money that we're looking. Hey, I say go for it. After
right,
you're clear about what that more meaningful looks like, I say start having conversations early. Start figuring out like what's happening in your organization. Who might be working on something
yeah,
that might be, the next big product, the next big launch that you might want to be a part of if that's what you're interested in. If you looked
right,
internally and you've just found that, it's a culture that just doesn't align with you, it's a culture that you find toxic, or it's just a mission that you don't really care about anymore or never really did to begin with, I believe that you can start looking externally in terms of creating and increasing your visibility. Remember, people can't hire you, people can't consider you for anything if you are a secret. And so when you start getting
right,
out there and going to your industry conferences, even if you have to pay for those industry conferences yourself, they are an investment in your external exposure. The people who you are going to meet, the people who are going to make introductions for you, the people who are going to add to your thought knowledge. A lot of people think,
right,
oh, well, if I send my people to conferences, I'm allowing my people to be poached. Not necessarily, because your people are going to conferences you know, for their own self-development and to understand more about your industry. And they're bringing that back into your organization. When I used to send my people to
right,
conferences, I'd always say, I need you to, come back and actually give us a one pager of like what were the highlights of what you gathered. I also wanted to see the PowerPoints because everything now is digital. Share all of the content. We created a library or a vault, a digital vault for our organization because of the conferences that people were going to. And once you are at these conferences as an attendee or as a speaker, you are now positioning yourself in such a way that you're now seen as a thought leader. You're now seen as an industry expert and someone that other people want on their teams. So that's one way to start
right,
increasing your external visibility aside from just simply posting to different roles and hoping, posting and praying about roles. I think that also on top of
right.
it, it's the networking that you're doing. There's a really great recruiter that I follow on LinkedIn who always shares that your next role most likely If you're already, at that director VP level, your next role most likely is not coming from LinkedIn. Your next role most likely is coming from a recruiter reaching out to you. Most likely is coming from someone in
Yep.
your network who knows what you do. I had a colleague who recently got
Right.
laid off by Starbucks, and he had no, like, pardon the pun, but there was no sour milk in his coffee about it. He felt like, look, I was one of the last
Yeah.
people hired. They tried a whole new initiative. It didn't work. So be it. He didn't send out not one resume. He just networked. He let people in his network know that he was now looking for work. And an awesome law firm picked him up because he had all of this great government relations experience. And that is most likely how the next role is going to come to you in this day and age.
Yep. Yep. Visibility again. I love that. So last question before we get to the speed round. For dads that are listening right now who just might feel stuck or overlooked or just tired, I'm not talking like meaningful work. They're just feeling kind of down on what they're doing. What would you want them to hear?
What is making you feel down? What is taking away
Yeah.
from your light? Like, what is it that's no longer fulfilling for you? Is it the hours that you're working? Is it the sacrifices that you're making? Is it the pay that you're making? Is it the work, the actual substantive work that you're doing that no longer resonates with you? What is it that's making you feel as though this just isn't right? This just isn't working for me. And as you said, it's so important to make sure that we're not just like blowing up our lives because we've experienced a moment of feeling like there's a signal. It's so important to
Right.
have these conversations to figure out, okay, so how are other people negotiating, making a change? How are other people, let's say, negotiating how they're finding better work assignments? And so I'm a really big believer in, learning vicariously through others and allowing other people's experiences to inform my experiences. I can't necessarily imprint their experiences, but what I can do is I can at least say, all right, there's a format. I'd also say start having the conversations and start putting together that personal board to help you think about the strategy that you could use to either understand what could you do in your current environment and what's available for you externally.
Yep. Love that. I think there's this element of slowing down in your answer, right? Of like, you said in the beginning of what is bringing you down in the moment, right? And it's kind of like taking a step back and analyzing. Because I think oftentimes we get in our own heads, right? And we make things out to be worse than maybe they are, or we feel more overwhelmed because like, I don't know how to get out of this. And it just kind of builds up and snowballs into this thing that we just can't control. But then we take a step back and we start to think it through, slow ourselves down, realize, okay, there are options, there are ways, steps that we can take, right? And having, like you said, having that personal board of directors now can help you slow those things down and help you put take some emotion out of the thought process so that you can think more logically in terms of what is holding you back or putting you down in the moment so that you can figure out, okay, what steps can I take? Right. Because you're not going to take 30 steps at once. You got to figure out what that
Mhm.
first step is. Right. And, you know, and so I love your answer because it's so straightforward of, okay, think about why, think of the why first, and then how do you layer on top of that? And if you have this board of directors, like there's a shortcut.
Here's a good example of how and where it is so important to take that pause and to get insights from other people. Let's go back to 2008, 2009. At that time, I was
Sure.
creating these video vignettes about the workplace because they were part of like a training curriculum. And I'd post them on YouTube
Mm,
because YouTube was free. And this one video in about two
right.
days got 100,000 views. And YouTube reached out to me and said, well, would you consider doing some advertisements, doing ad space on your YouTube channel? And I thought, no, my work is serious. I'm not doing
Right.
that. I didn't have a personal board back then. I could
Yeah.
have been a YouTuber. If I knew what YouTube's potential was, had I had someone that I could
Right.
have bounced ideas off of, pressure tested this with, had someone give me a very different and unique perspective, I would have been able to get out of my own head in my own way. And who knows? I could have been the Mrs. Beast of the workplace on YouTube.
That's great. I love it. It's interesting. I mean, it's fascinating because impossible to know like what the future is, right? But you only had your own perspective there, right? You didn't have other perspectives of many people that in that space could be like, oh, well, this is going to be the next big thing. Here's why. Here's you could see the numbers starting to go. Like you said, it's like you're in your own head, and it's just hard
If I had
to
my
break free of that.
insider, I would have been able to make a very different decision back in 2009 that would have Natalie
Yeah.
in a very different place in 2026.
Yeah. Yeah. Great story. I appreciate that. All right. So we're going to go from the wild world of YouTube to the wild world of our speed round here. 5 quick questions for you, starting with what's the first kid show theme song that comes to mind?
Sesame Street.
Sesame Street. Okay. The ultimate classic. Isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, who doesn't love a little Big Bird?
Right. That's right. What was your very first job?
Newspaper carrier. Yep. New York
Newspaper carrier.
Newsday out of Long Island. It probably was one of the worst
Wow.
business models ever. Because I didn't get paid. They basically hired, preteens and teenagers to deliver newspapers, and we had to give them a certain cut of, whatever we collected from our newspaper
Right.
clients. And so after about 2 or 3 weeks, my mom started asking, so, where's your actual paycheck? And I said, I don't think I actually have one. And so my mom called the company and said, well, wait a second, how does she get paid? And they said, oh, well, she gets to keep the tips that she gets. Now, there were some people who were in arrears who hadn't paid for their newspaper in weeks. So as you can imagine, my tips were going toward paying for those arrears. Needless to say, that didn't last long.
Wow. Wow. That's wild. Would you rather spend 24 hours with a toddler-sized T-Rex or a T-Rex-sized toddler?
I think I'd go with the first one.
Toddler-sized T-Rex?
Absolutely, because the other one might be too big.
Oh. That's fair. That's fair. Yeah. T-Rex-sized toddler would be very large.
I can actually play with the first one, right? If I'm hearing this correctly.
Right. I mean, I don't know how a T-Rex behaves, but at least they're toddler size, so maybe you can wrangle it. So.
Maybe put it in my garage or something.
Close the doors and hope for the best. What's your go-to karaoke song or the one you would sing if you had to?
Losing My Religion by R.E.M. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That is like one of the most emotional songs out there. He says, I'm losing my religion.
Great song. Yeah. Iconic from the early 90s. What's the weirdest thing you've ever carried around in your bag, briefcase, or pockets?
Crazy glue. I'm a mom. So I just never know when something's going to break.
Yeah. It's a great point.
So I've had people whose shoes have separated, the sole came off.
Yeah.
I say, I can fix that for you. And in that moment, I'm sure there's that moment where people think at the same time, this is odd, but hey, this is actually very useful. No judgment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Exactly. That's smart. Love that. Now, before we wrap up, I want to make sure people know where to find you and how to go deeper into your work. What are you working on right now? And where should people go if they want to connect with you or learn more?
So my company's website is questei.org. So Quest Employment Initiatives, we are an investigations firm that, goes into workplaces that may have instances of or complaints of discrimination, harassment, retaliation. And, there is a risk assessment that I have on the site now, and where if individuals and particularly companies want to make sure that their organizations are a good space in terms of being low risk when it comes to being regulatory compliant, Once again, it's a very short assessment. Check yourself out. If your scores are not what you want them to be, give me a call. I would love to have the conversation with you as to how do we get you to a place of, once again, great scores. And then there's also the NatalieHolderSpeaks.com website. So NatalieHolderSpeaks.com, that's where companies will reach out to me to have a better sense of, or to, create a workshop around issues like the personal board of directors. How do you construct one? How do you ensure that the one that you're creating actually will help you become more innovative in your workspace? And so those are two places where you can find me.
Awesome. I love that. We'll put those in the links to those in the show notes. I appreciate that. Natalie, thank you so much for this conversation. I learned so much in this, but in a way that is motivating, right? Sometimes I have a conversation that, I learn from people and it's like, okay, now I've got some work to do. And it's, it feels almost overwhelming. This was a conversation to me that highlighted challenges, but then gave very practical ways to address those challenges in a way that makes me want to like immediately go and start implementing them, right? Like this personal board of directors idea and putting yourself out there more, you make it achievable, right? And I appreciate that you gave us a way to think about some of these things a little bit differently and gave us a way to actually do something about them. So thank you for coming on and sharing that. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you being here. And finally, before you go, if you're a dad listening to this and you find yourself in between navigating a season that feels different, head to gap2gig.com and subscribe to the Gap to Gig newsletter. It comes out every Friday and it's a quieter space to reflect on work, life, and what really matters right now. And if this conversation resonated, consider sending it to another dad who might need to hear it. Until next time, I'm Michael Jacobs. Thanks for showing up and listening to Gap to Gig.